California safe handgun. Now, if you're like me, you immediately assume this is newspeak and has nothing to do with safety, but this actually does include some safety requirements. But I'm going to get to the point. When we get to the microstamping part, it's pork barrel. Manual or automatic hammer retraction and or firing pin not resting on primer, or make it a gun that won't go off unless you manually fire the damn gun. As the joke goes, even a flare gun made entirely out of plastic, hell, even some cap guns, are made so that they won't go off if you hit the hammer. You have to pull the trigger to move a piece of metal out of the way so that the hammer can move forward. The hammer is not allowed to move forward, and it has an integrated firing pin. Also, another design issue is just to make the gun function, a lot of guns, even break action, will have a firing pin. And here's your breech face, and it won't stick out. Not only that, it won't just come to the surface, it goes back further to where it's held back with a spring and is driven forward by a hammer. And the spring is made tight enough that unless you drop it from like 80 feet, it won't be able to hit the primer and go off. ATF type approved, procedure for proving you have a manually operated safety device. It just has to have a safety. They reference the ATF. This is California compliance, by the way. DOJ certified lab requirements for handguns, using 3 examples you have to submit. Now, here's brings up a funny problem. If you're making a gun just for yourself, in order to do this test, you would have to be, they're going to treat you like you're a manufacturer who's making guns for sale. Now, here's the catch-22 on purpose built. If I want to make a semi-automatic weapon of my own design, I'd have to provide 3 examples. But I'm doing this to get the legal ability to make, keep, and bear arms for myself, which implies that I'm not making it for sale or making more than one. So the requirement was for individuals, you could submit the gun for testing to get it added to the list of guns that are allowed. If you make it like another gun that's already been approved, especially type approved, that means it's already considered approved. You're just testing it, which means you could technically say, I built this to the exact standards as a 1911 with drop safety and a bunch of other things we're going to talk about integrated, and have them test it like you would having a proofing house in Britain do it. They would just treat it that way. This is a lot like making your own car from scratch. That's frowned upon, but it's allowed, but you'd have to allow them to test it. Not necessarily to destruction, but you have to accept the fact that during a drop test and other things, it might get damaged. Just make a bunch of extra parts, but don't assemble them. This all just seems kind of hinky, but anyway, this is mostly for a manufacturer who wishes to sell these. Firing requirement for handguns, aka the proof test. 600 rounds have to be fired with no more than 6 malfunctions, and the first 20 have to go without a malfunction at all. And this is through 3 guns, or 1 if you request an exemption. You can request to be given a gimme on these things because they're obviously meant for something completely unrelated to an individual. But the malfunctions are defined as any failure to properly feed, fire, or eject a round, or be able to get the cartridge out of the cylinder if it's a revolver or a single shot, or it firing or not firing correctly, or not being able to load mechanically. Let's say you have a pump action shotgun you want them to test, and it has to function completely. The removal and insertion of a magazine has to work flawlessly and not have more than 6 malfunctions total during 600 shots. And in the first 20 shots, none of these things can fail. It's okay if it fails within 600 shots slightly, but not chronically. The slide, if it is designed to remain open after it's been expended, has to stay open. It actually has to do the feature. If you add extra features in, which is more complexity, it has to succeed, and you can't have a cumulative more than 6 failures in 600 shots during the tests. And that apparently is per gun. So they're going to fire 1,800 shots. And this also, if you're not aware of it, implies that you're using conventional ammunition. It's more than a single shot weapon. If it's a single shot, break action, or bolt action, it doesn't have to have these requirements because the nature of those things usually have all of the characteristics we're talking about here. They're too simple to screw up, but they still have to have the, again, it has to disengage the ability to fire it unless you are intending to fire it. Period. It has to be drop safe. Most shotguns aren't drop safe, but you can make them drop safe. But anyway, let's go on. Most older style designs. Primed case, no powder, no projectile, drop tests on a concrete slab, performed at a meter or so. Basically 40 inches is what's indicated here. I'm not going to go into the way they type it up. Only a lawyer could screw up a measurement. How high do you drop it? And I should point out, in the past I've been involved at a place that did drop testing that was more extreme. We had to do it from, if you're not aware of it, from half a foot, 1 foot, 3 feet, 6 feet, 12, 24, and then finally 50 feet. And then indicate, we had to do it until it failed, or what height did it fail at. And we did a group of testing at each height to try to get it to go off. The light drop test at 6 inches or whatever was because there were some guns that did that. That was a lab that I worked at that did all sorts of other things. It was a summer job. Anyway, prime case test, no projectile or powder, from about 40 inches. Cocked, safety off, condition such and such, and dropped to see if it'll go off without you pulling a trigger. Normal firing position, horizontal barrel, dropped like this, and also dropped sideways on either side. I would, of course, at the shop I was at, also drop it at a 45-degree angle on each angle. We just did all the angles by dropping it, and we dropped them at 10 times each. But this one doesn't necessarily say that. Next, dropping an arm on the grip, or pointing up, bang, and then dropping it muzzle first. So muzzle versus breech drop. And specifically, also, if it has an exposed hammer or striker or plunger, sometimes called, it's actually not a plunger, you're pulling the plunger, so it's not really plunging, and or racking the slide, dropping it that way on the rearmost part to try to make it go off, and muzzle first. But then again, that goes along with all the other stuff here. It must not fire any of the prime cases when not operated by a person firing it. So if it's not in a firing condition or operating condition, it can't go off. And it must fire when you want to shoot it. It can't have a failure of any kind. These are all based on it not screwing up and not going off when it's not supposed to. So basically these are, standards requirements. And this is well within the purview of a state to say you have to make a gun pass the safety test. You can make cars require that are different than national testing. They do have that. Some states, well, not states in the United States, but there are some countries that require that if you sell a new car in some countries, they had a requirement, some still do, that it float. I'm not kidding. Because they had a huge problem with people drowning, and they decided all cars have to float that are manufactured after a certain point so that people can buy cars that won't sink. They actually did that. But anyway, now this is all, again, repeating it, drop safety test as a legal requirement. Okay. Basically having the gun not go off by accident. It has to be reliable enough to pass 600 stinking rounds, which, okay, I guess the high points excluded. I had to do a joke. And it has to have the basics of having the hammer and or firing pin, preferably both, not able to set it off. And this has only got a 40-inch test. I mean, I understand this may be a standard, but I remember beating things to death to make sure they wouldn't go off. Because hunters drop shit. Because I was working for a quote-unquote lab, but really just a gun maker / gunsmith. And he didn't like, as he said, mamby-pamby bullshit requirements. He wanted a gun that wouldn't go off unless you made it go off. There's also no mention of how many pounds pull you have to have on the trigger, and whether or not you have snag testing. It doesn't mention having a trigger guard. But it is safety requirements. Now, I'm going to read the extra things here. I'm going to get to the micro-stamping just clusterfuck in a minute. But July 2022, new added on things. Chamber load indicator. It has to be a positive indication that the chamber is in fact loaded. Not that the gun has been put in a position that would load it if you defeated some feature. It has to literally indicate that there is a chambered round. That means if you try to fool it into thinking, indicating that it's open but it doesn't have a cartridge in it, that should be a failure as well. So that's actually kind of interesting, although I'm pretty sure that's not how it's read. I've seen a couple of guns that are designed that if you trick it into thinking it's loaded, when it's not, it'll actually indicate it's not loaded. But anyway, positive indication of a loaded round in chamber. The chamber, if you're not aware of it, in most, if not all guns, obviously some of them are not like this, is the chamber and the barrel are integral, so the cartridge is in there and the rifled barrel is afterwards, or whatever barrel. So yeah. If it has a detachable magazine, it has to have a disconnect mechanism that prevents ignition through the primer. It prevents it from firing if it's not got a magazine inserted. Some of them are required by that day to have that. You can't pull out the magazine and still fire it. Because by and large, most people assume that even though you can chamber around and pull out the magazine, that really isn't something that should let it go off. If you pull the magazine out of a gun, it should disable it. Okay. But that's in 2022. Firing pin, tip, and breech face that transfer the make, model, and serial number of the pistol in some way, encoded or whatever, to each cartridge case fired, microstamping, a proprietary monopoly technology patented by Todd, I can't pronounce it, of Nanomark, ID Dynamics, Seattle, Washington. No production firearm has been able to meet this requirement since the 2013 date it went into place. Cops are exempt, and many people and many organizations and companies begged for an exemption or used grandfathered previous designs and refused to implement it. But guns were added to the safe list if they fit all the other requirements, so they weren't required. Basically, no new guns in California. And the claim is that this was done on purpose to encumber your bodily fluids and your gun rights and stuff or whatever. No, it's because some large company got a pork barrel idea here. And the funny thing is, a lot of companies in the industry have refused to let Todd here of Nanomark get any money because they're just not going to do it. And I've come up with a patent breaker. Todd Lizotte. California added a new thing onto it to try to make this happen. For 2022, any method unencumbered by patent restriction that's an equivalent to this that would transfer, and they specify from the firing pin or breech face of the gun. The patent is the ability to do it through the firing pin or breech face during firing. The way to break this patent is to just have every manufacturer come up with their own code by making a new standard, clearly marking in the surface area for the back of the cartridge only, not the second requirement of the firing pin, the serial number and make and model as a code, ID code, that would be the same thing, not microstamped, but visible, so that you would open the gun up, look at the breech face, and that'd be where the serial number is also reprinted. The trouble is, almost all of these parts are transferable and removable. The open source method I came up with was to make it to where the barrel and chamber, which are easily changed as well, would mark the casing and the bullet by having the rifling extend into the chamber and the rifling being a pattern like barcode. But that's not acceptable because it has to be attached to the gun itself. But again, the breech face and firing pin are changeable. This should have never been a rule. This was a way of making money for this company. Somebody got paid off. Anyway, hope this was informative. Most of these are really safety requirements and one pork barrel politics thing. Thanks for watching. Have a good day. Good luck with that. It's about safety.